The gate would not move, calves were piling against each other in the smoke, and Glenn was shoving with both hands when something taller than any man stepped out of the plum thicket and leaned one massive shoulder into the steel. I heard the hinge scream, I heard the chain snap, and the whole panel swung wide just enough for 23 bawling calves to funnel into bare ground. Glenn did not run, he just said, "Easy now," and that figure stood there breathing like a bellows before backing into flame-lit trees. But to understand how I got there, I need to go back to a showroom floor in Hutchinson 15 years earlier. In March of 2009, my father, Scott Halverson, stood beside a new John Deere 8 335R with showroom lights reflected in the paint, quoting monthly payments the way preachers quote scripture. He was good at it, and I mean that plainly, because he could hold a room with numbers, confidence, and a clean pressed shirt that never seemed to catch dust. Glenn Mercer walked in wearing faded brown overalls, patched at both knees, a canvas coat rubbed shiny at the cuffs, and boots with one toe stitched twice. He drove a 1992 Chevrolet C2500 with 312,400 miles, rust above both wheel wells, and a feed sack tied over the broken passenger window. My father looked once at that truck through the glass and made his decision about Glenn before any words were spoken. Glenn had come for injector lines and a hydraulic coupler for his 1974 John Deere 443. Oh, the tractor everybody in Reno County called Green Penny because it was old enough to be dismissed but dependable enough to shame newer paint. My father tapped the parts counter and told him, in front of 3 salesmen and 2 coffee drinkers, "That machine is done. Glenn, you are throwing good money after bad." He offered a trade package with a $38,000 down payment, 7-year note, 6.75% fixed for 2 years, variable after. Projected payment $3,412 each month. Glenn listened, nodded once, and said he needed $287.40 in parts, plus 2 gallons of hydraulic fluid, plus tax. That was the moment everybody remembers, because my father laughed, not cruelly to his own ears, but loud enough for the room to hear, and said, "Your old iron will die before harvest." Glenn put 3 $100 bills on the counter, counted out the change from a worn envelope, and carried his parts out without one extra sentence. My father shook his head and told me, "That man will either modernize or disappear." I believed him because I was 26 and still mistook polish for truth. I have told this story twice before, once to my mother when the dealership closed, once to myself while sitting in Glenn's machine shed at midnight. Because this scene was the first crack in what I thought I knew. But the crack stayed small for years. Therefore, I kept living the same way, selling debt as growth and calling it service. Glenn kept farming quietly around Concordia and down into Cloud County leases. Therefore, I only saw him when he came for seals, bearings, and old manuals nobody else wanted. Glenn's backstory was not hidden, but few people listened long enough to hear it. In 1981, when he was 14, he stood beside his mother at a farm auction north of Jamestown in Cloud County. While their rented 240 acres changed hands one lot at a time. His father had borrowed operating money at 11.2% in 1978, refinanced machinery at 13.9% in 1979, and rolled 2 bad wheat years into a larger note just before rates spiked. By 1981, the renewal offer came at 19.5%. There was no way through it. 3 gravity wagons sold for less than the note balance, 2 tractors went next, and his mother folded the grocery list in her pocket, because there was nothing to buy that week. Glenn never told this with drama. He just said the numbers stopped adding up, and that decision made for him became a rule he never broke. At 19, he worked dawn to noon on a dairy outside Concordia for $4.75 an hour. Therefore, he could save while renting 80 acres of dry land wheat from a retired couple, Elmer and June Talbot, at $42 per acre cash rent. His first tractor was a 1968 International 8 5.6 bought at a consignment auction for $4,600, plus $780 in repairs, with labor done himself at night. Fuel, seed, fertilizer, and rent totaled $9,940 his first season, and gross revenue at harvest was $14,280. Therefore, net before taxes and living expenses was $4,340. He kept $1,000 for food, fuel, and boots, put $3,340 in a savings account, and wrote one sentence in a ledger he still owns: "Debt makes weather fatal." By 1990, he had leased 320 acres total, running that old International, plus a borrowed drill he paid for in labor. But he also started what became his pattern: buying broken equipment everyone else feared. In November 1991, he bought a 1974 John Deere 443 with 10,920 hours for $8,900 because the transmission slipped in high range. Dealer estimate to rebuild was $7,200. Glenn and a neighbor mechanic named Ira Bell rebuilt it in Glenn's shop for $1,940 in parts and 37 evenings of labor. He paid Ira in freezer beef and $600 cash. That tractor logged another 17,000 hours over 3 decades. Therefore, the cost per operating hour stayed below $1 before fuel. People called that stubborn. Glenn called it arithmetic. When yields were good, he stored grain and sold in tranches, 20% at harvest for immediate bills, 40% in winter if basis improved, 40% held for spring rallies when possible. He carried crop insurance at moderate levels. Therefore, he was protected against disaster, but not paying for top-tier premiums he could not justify. His lifestyle stayed plain enough to invite jokes: same truck, same patched coveralls, same 2-room office over a cellar with a rattling box fan. But if you looked at his books, every decision had a reason, and every reason tied back to surviving years when weather and markets turn against pride. I watched my father and others dismiss him for 15 years. But Glenn's ledger kept growing. 1994, leased 480 acres total, net farm income $38,200, savings account year-end $64,700. 1997, bought 160 acres near Milton Vale at $615 per acre, total $98,400, paid cash from savings and wheat proceeds. 2001, bought a used 1990 John Deere 9,600 combine from a bankruptcy auction for $29,500, spent $6,100 rebuilding feeder house and separator. Total cost $35,600. Equivalent newer model priced at $124,000 used lot value. 2004, added 120 acres at $860 per acre, total $103,200 cash. 2008, operating reserve reached $412,000 across insured accounts and short treasuries. 2011, bought 200 acres near Aurora at $1,950 per acre. Total $390,000 cash after one strong wheat and milo cycle. My father saw those same years differently. He saw Glenn refusing efficiency, refusing GPS integration packages, refusing finance planters with manufacturer rebates. The dealership business model rewarded turnover, therefore used repair culture, looked like disloyalty in that building. We sold aspiration as risk management. New iron, lower downtime, tax strategy. Some of that was true for some operations. But the part we did not say loudly enough was simple. Finance growth only works when margin, weather, and rates stay friendly together. In Kansas, they rarely stay friendly together for long. 3 good people in our counties learned that without any moral failure on their part, just one bad chain of timing. Wade Hensley, out of North Reno County, expanded from 1,100 acres to 2,000 in 2013 by signing leases and financing a planter, sprayer, and combine package totaling $1,480,000 at 4.25% variable after introductory period. His blended monthly equipment payment was $16,920. Corn slipped, wheat slipped, diesel climbed, and by 2016, his variable rate had reset to 7.8%. Payment rose to $19,740. He sold 2 pickups, cashed retirement, and still fell behind. In 2017, he lost every lease except 220 acres around his house and took a maintenance job in town. He still shakes your hand with both of his and asks about your kids. Carla and Tom Pruitt, near Partridge, were careful people, church volunteers, payroll first employers who paid workers before paying themselves. In 2012, they financed $890,000 of machinery at 6.9% over 7 years and signed a land note for 320 acres at $1,200,000, variable tied to prime. They believed they had enough scale to weather downturns. But wheat dropped below projected break-even and irrigation repairs stacked up, therefore cash flow tightened. By 2018, prime moved up. Their land note rate reached 8.6%. Annual debt service pushed above $214,000, and one hail event erased their margin. They sold machinery at auction values, 28% below note balances, and negotiated deed in lieu on the land note. They did not fail because they were foolish. They were trapped by a narrow set of years where nothing broke their way. Miguel Herrera started as a custom cutter, then leased 600 acres near Pretty Prairie with an operating line that looked manageable at first, $420,000 revolving at 5.1%. In 2021, drought cut yield sharply. Therefore, he drew more on the line for feed and seed. In 2022, rates climbed. Interest hit 9.4%. Annual interest expense alone reached roughly $39,000 before principal reduction. He did everything right operationally, but drought plus rates plus input inflation boxed him in. He filed Chapter 12 in late 2023, kept his house by restructuring, and now runs a repair shop with his brother in Hutchinson. He still farms 90 acres of family ground on weekends because farming was never just a business to him. Dean Collins in Cloud County had paid off his own 240 acres by age 58, but he co-signed a $2,300,000 hog barn expansion for his son in 2019 when Packer contracts looked steady. Feed costs rose, disease losses hit, and contract terms shifted. Therefore, refinancing came with harder collateral requirements. Dean pledged his paid-off acres to protect his son, and when restructuring failed in 2024, he sold that land to settle guarantee exposure. He did not blame his son. He said he would sign again for family. But he now rents a house in Concordia and works part-time at the co-op grain office. Through all of that, Glenn kept doing unglamorous things that sounded boring in coffee shops, but looked brilliant in bad years. He kept 6 months of input costs in cash reserves, sometimes 10. He pre-bought fertilizer only when discounts beat carrying costs. He fixed bearings before harvest, not during harvest. He never signed variable notes for iron. In 2015, when dealers offered zero-down promotions, he spent $14,200 refreshing Greenpenny's hydraulics and clutch instead of financing a $218,000 tractor package. Calculated over 7 years at 6.2%, that package would have cost about $266,000 total. Glenn's route cost under $20,000. Therefore, he preserved over $240,000 of flexibility. Before we go further, if you want to see how this old tractor and one quiet man end up rewriting an entire county's idea of wealth, subscribe now, because the part most people in Kansas still whisper about happens after the dealership closes and after the fire starts. In 2019, Deere Corporate rolled out facility standards that hit smaller dealers hard: updated frontage, expanded service bays, digital diagnostics wing, customer lounge upgrades, and inventory thresholds tied to territory rights. For a large metro group, may be manageable. For our family store in Hutchinson, thin margins and existing floor plan debt made it dangerous. The required remodel quote came in at $3,200,000. Our balance sheet already carried roughly $1,870,000 in floor plan exposure and $620,000 on property notes. My father insisted growth would save us, same language we had sold for years. Therefore, we signed pre-construction commitments, expecting 2 strong seasons to absorb the payment. But 2020 supply chain delays wrecked turnover, 2021 margin compression squeezed service, and 2022 borrowing costs rose fast. By late 2023, the math was gone. The notice came in January 2024, liquidation pending unless recapitalization secured within 60 days. I remember my father holding that letter without speaking for almost a full minute. Therefore, the room felt smaller than it was. He had built that place over 31 years and believed hustle could carry any burden. But age, stress, and stubbornness cost him. He suffered a heart attack in March and survived, though he retired immediately and moved to a small rental near his sister in Salina. He was alive, but his voice had changed, quieter and shorter, as if each sentence now had to justify its own weight. Liquidation day arrived in June under hard sun and dust. 57 lots of parts inventory, 9 service lifts, computer systems, shelving, 2 old service trucks, and the side lot parcel where overflow equipment had sat for years. Farmers came to bid, scrap crews came to bid, and a few of us came because we could not believe it was ending. Glenn parked his same 1992 Chevy by the chain-link fence, now at 337,000 miles, with primer spots on the doors and a mismatched tailgate from a white truck. He wore the same faded cap, same patched overalls. People barely looked at him. When Lot 44 opened, full legacy parts inventory, usable mixed stock, bidding moved from $120,000 to $260,000 quickly. Glenn raised one finger at $300,000. Someone topped at $340,000. Glenn said $380,000. Silence. Hammer fell. Lot 51, side lot parcel, 6.7 acres, commercial, opening $420,000. A regional buyer offered $500,000. Glenn bid $540,000, then $610,000, then $700,000 flat. Sold. Lot 57, service tools, and machine package. Glenn took it at $62,000. Total with fees and tax came to $1,147,836. He paid with 2 cashier checks and 1 wire confirmation. No financing contingency, no partner listed. That was the day the county realized the man in the rusted truck had liquidity, larger than many polished operations. But Glenn did not celebrate or lecture. He shook the auctioneer's hand, asked where to load shelving, and arranged transport with 3 local haulers, paid in full by Friday. He looked at me once and said, "Your father built a good parts room. Would be a waste to scatter it." That was all. Let me stop here and ask you something, because this story turns on it. When somebody around you looks poor, are you seeing poverty, or are you seeing priorities you have not bothered to measure? Drop your answer in the comments if you have ever misread a person by the truck they drove. The weeks after liquidation were not dramatic, they were procedural, which is how real rebuilding usually looks. Glenn moved the inventory to the side lot building and opened Mercer Repair Supply, 3 bays, parts counter, and a tool library where young operators could borrow specialty pullers and diagnostic gear for a refundable deposit. He hired Miguel Herrera as lead mechanic at $31 an hour, plus health coverage, because Miguel had skill and needed stable ground after bankruptcy. He hired me, too, at $24 an hour to manage inventory and vendor accounts, despite my last name and the years I had spent selling him notes he never wanted. He told me on day 1, keep clean books and do not round numbers to make yourself feel better. But the larger move came in August 2024, when Glenn formed the Mercer Soil and Tools Trust, with an initial funding amount of $6,500,000, split between cash, Treasury ladder holdings, and 640 acres of debt-free land transferred into the trust at appraised value $2,880,000. The trust charter had one purpose: zero-interest bridge loans and below-market land contracts for producers under 40 who completed 3 seasons of audited operating records and agreed to mentor one newer farmer later. This was not charity without structure. It was discipline, transferred to the next person with terms clear enough to survive sentiment. Mara Jensen was first approved, age 32, running 180 leased acres near Concordia, with excellent records but no collateral for expansion. The trust sold her 160 acres at $2,100 per acre, when surrounding comparable sales averaged about $4,800. Total contract price $336,000, payable over 15 years at 0%. Annual payment $22,400. Market financing at 7.4% over 15 years on $768,000 market value would have cost around $85,000 yearly before taxes and insurance. Glenn's structure lowered annual burden by over $62,000. Therefore, Mara could build reserves, not just make payments. She planted wheat and soy rotation with conservative inputs, and by year 2, she had $94,000 in operating cash reserve. Wade Hensley received a different kind of help. Glenn bought a worn but serviceable 2008 planter for $38,500 and a used nurse trailer for $9,200, then leased both to Wade for $1 per year for 3 years with maintenance responsibility only. Glenn also covered $42,300 in medical debt Wade had carried since his wife's surgery, paid directly to providers with no public mention. Wade used the breathing room to rebuild his 220-acre operation and added a side income calibrating sprayers for neighbors. By spring 2026, he had no consumer debt and one paid-off pickup, Carla and Tom Pruitt had moved into town after losing their place. Therefore, Glenn approached them through their daughter Bethany to avoid pride wounds. The trust offered Bethany a beginning farmer package, 80 acres leased at $95 per acre, when local rate was $165, plus access to tool library, plus $60,000, zero-interest operating line capped to invoices only. Tom managed field operations at a modest salary, Carla handled books, and Bethany made marketing decisions under mentoring oversight. 3 seasons later, they were solvent, and in 2028, Bethany exercised a purchase option on that same 80 acres at pre-agreed $2,600 per acre, while market had climbed above $5,000. Carla says they did not get rescued. They got restarted with rules. Miguel Herrera took no favors at first, only work. But Glenn noticed him staying late to repair others' equipment and finally offered a structured path, $180,000 zero-interest loan for a 40% stake in Mercer Repair Supply expansion, repayable over 10 years with quarterly profit-sharing triggers. Miguel accepted when he realized the terms rewarded caution instead of volume at all costs. By 2029, he had repaid $72,000 and built a separate emergency fund of $120,000. He now employs 5 technicians, 2 from families hit by foreclosures, and every one of them gets paid training on hydraulics and diagnostics. Dean Collins could not get his acres back, but Glenn made sure he did not vanish from agriculture. The trust funded a retirement lease stipend, $1,500 per month for 8 years, in exchange for Dean mentoring young livestock operators on feed contracts and biosecurity planning. Dean calls it the first check he ever got for just thinking. He still misses his land, but he is no longer carrying shame for trying to help his son. If you are learning something from this, pass this video to one person in your life who equates visible struggle with failure, because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding everyone up. I should tell you what happened with my father, because unresolved relationships turn stories into myths, and this was never a myth. After retirement, he stayed in Salina, attended cardiac rehab, and visited Hutchinson twice a month for follow-up appointments. He asked me once whether Glenn had really paid cash that day. I showed him the settlement statement. He nodded, took a long breath, and said, "I spent 20 years trying to sell that man away from his best decision." In 2025, he recorded a short talk for the Regional Equipment Association, admitting smaller operators needed a used first advisory model and that debt recommendations must be stress-tested at higher rates before any signature. He passed away in November 2025 from a second cardiac event. At his memorial, Glenn stood in the back row and left before lunch. The fire came the next summer in July 2026, and that is where the story you open with returns. Drought had left grass brittle across southern Reno County. One lightning strike started a line that moved faster than forecasts expected, and several pastures were cut off from county roads by smoke. Glenn's place had a low draw with enough green strip to hold cattle if gates opened in time. Therefore, neighbors were pushing stock toward his boundary through heat and confusion. I was there because I had become useful, and because I still felt I owed something that could not be invoiced. We had one problem after another. First, a hinge pin jammed, but Glenn cut chain and bought minutes. Next, a trailer tongue snapped. Therefore, we rerouted through the north lane. Then calves bunched at the lower gate where an old cottonwood root had shifted the post, and smoke got thick enough to make distance hard to judge. That was when we heard brush moving uphill, heavy and deliberate, not panicked like deer. Glenn lifted his head but did not freeze. I remember because his face changed less than mine did. I am not a person who believes quickly in things I cannot measure. I want that clear. But what stepped out had shoulders above the top rail, long arms with dark hair matted by ash, and a gait that was careful, almost reluctant, like it knew exactly where not to put weight. It did not charge us. It looked from Glenn to the gate to the calves. Therefore, the next motion made more sense than fear did. It leaned into the steel where both of us had failed, shifted enough force to clear the bind, and held while animals streamed through. I could hear its breath. I could smell wet earth and smoke. Glenn said, "Easy now," same tone he used on skittish heifers. The figure turned its head toward him and paused long enough for me to see one eye catch firelight. Not red, not glowing, just dark and aware. Then it stepped back into scrub oak and disappeared along the creek line without breaking branches the way panic would. The entire encounter lasted perhaps 20 seconds. I measured that against my pulse later and still cannot make it longer. But the emotional length was larger, because in that smoke, Glenn looked less surprised than grateful, and I realized he had carried room in his world for things I had mocked without ever admitting it. We got all cattle through by midnight, 143 head, counted with 2 minor burns treated by the vet the next morning. No deaths on Glenn's side. 2 neighboring operations lost fences and haystacks. Therefore, trust funds released emergency microgrants, $12,000 to one family, $18,500 to another, same-day wire transfers for posts, wire, and feed. Glenn never discussed the figure publicly. If asked, he said the fire taught us to keep gates maintained and water points clear. But later that week, he told me to add one line item to the emergency plan: keep lower gate hinges greased every 30 days in dry season, because help may not arrive twice. But the deeper arithmetic of Glenn's life is what still matters most. Therefore, here is the sequence people request whenever they think this is luck instead of design. 1986. Started with $3,340 saved. 1990. Cumulative savings and retained earnings roughly $42,000. 1997. First land purchase, $98,400 cash. 2004. Total owned acreage, 280, debt zero. 2008. Reserves $412,000. 2011. Bought 200 acres for $390,000 cash. 2015, avoided finance tractor package, preserved about $240,000 over life of note. 2019, total owned acreage reached 760, appraised value about $2,650,000 at local comps. 2024, liquid assets available before trust funding, approximately $4,200,000. 2024, trust funded at $6,500,000 through cash plus land contributions. 2026, net worth after grants, contracts, and market changes estimated near $8,900,000 with zero personal debt. His personal expense sheet looked almost absurd by modern standards. Housing cost near zero because farmhouse was paid and maintained incrementally. Annual property tax and insurance about $5,900. Food and household supplies around $7,400. Clothing about $650, mostly work gear. Utilities and fuel for home about $4,200. Healthcare insurance and out-of-pocket around $11,300. Truck maintenance averaged $2,100 yearly, because old trucks are cheap only if you can wrench and wait. Total annual personal spending often sat between $31,000 and $38,000, while farm retained earnings in good years were several multiples of that. Therefore, cash accumulated where it mattered in resilience, not display. People ask whether Glenn ever enjoyed his money. The question assumes enjoyment must look like upgrade culture. His enjoyment looked like options, buying fertilizer in downturns, paying workers early, helping a family stay in agriculture, sleeping through rate hike headlines, and driving to Concordia on a Tuesday to watch his grandson play shortstop without checking commodity prices every inning. He did buy one newer vehicle in 2027, a used 2016 Ford F-25, with 148,000 miles for $26,800 cash. But he kept the 1992 Chevy running for feed duty and local runs. It still starts more often than pride should allow. Mara Jensen's outcome deserves precision because it shows multiplier effect better than speeches. By 2031, her 160-acre contract had principal balance down to $201,600. She leased an additional 240 acres conservatively, maintained debt at zero except seasonal inputs, paid from operating cash, and reported average annual net over 5 years near $146,000 after labor and reserves. She mentored 2 younger farmers per trust rules. One of them, Isaac Bloom, now manages 300 acres with positive retained earnings and no long-term notes. Therefore, one discounted contract to Mara did not just stabilize one life, it seeded at least 2 more viable operators within a decade. Bethany Pruitt completed her 80-acre purchase and added a 40-acre parcel in 2030 using saved cash, plus a small fixed note she paid in 3 years. Tom reduced field hours after a knee replacement, but still runs planting windows. Carla leads bookkeeping workshops through the trust, teaching cash flow stress tests using real county numbers and no-shame language. Their family hosts Sunday dinners on the same ground they once feared they would never see again. Miguel expanded Mercer Repair Supply into a second bay cluster in Hutchinson by 2032. Revenue passed $1,200,000, with net margins kept disciplined around 14% because he refused low-quality volume jobs that burn labor. He repaid his trust note in full by 2033, 2 years early, and immediately funded a $75,000 tool grant pool for apprentices who complete certification and stay local 3 years. The day he wrote that check, Glenn said, "Pay me when you can" has a good echo when people mean it. Wade Hensley never got back to his old acreage footprint, but he rebuilt dignity first, acreage second. By 2030, he was farming 340 acres, all manageable, no long-term equipment notes, custom calibration business, earning another $48,000 annually. His wife's health improved, medical debt gone, and their daughter returned from Wichita to help with precision mapping weekends. Wade still drives a 2004 pickup with paint peeling on the hood. He smiles when people joke, because he knows what surviving costs. Dean Collins retired from regular work in 2031 and now lives in a modest duplex in Concordia with a vegetable patch out back. He still consults one morning each week for young livestock producers and still misses his old farm on windy days. His son eventually stabilized a smaller hog operation under tighter contracts and no family guarantees. Dean says that lesson came expensive, but clear. What about the figure by the gate? The one question that follows me into every room where I tell this. I still do not have a tidy answer. We found one impression next morning in damp ash, near the lower draw, length roughly 16 inches, width just over 7, stride farther apart than mine by a distance I could not comfortably fake in boots. But no plaster cast was taken because we were fixing fences, checking water and helping neighbors with hay relocation. Life kept moving. Therefore, mystery remained where it started, at the edge of practical work. I have thought about that night for years, and the part that stays is not fear. The part that stays is proportion. Something vast appeared in a moment when our own strength was insufficient, did one necessary thing, and left without asking for witness. Glenn never built a legend around it. He simply adjusted maintenance schedules, funded fire break equipment for 2 neighboring districts, and added water trailers to shared emergency plans. If you want to understand Glenn Mercer, that is the key. He translates wonder into responsibility. For the record, because complete stories matter, Glenn is 72 now and still farms a reduced 520 acres directly while leasing additional land through trust structures to younger operators. Green Penny, the 1974 John Deere, 443. Oh, my father called done. Still logs around 140 hours per year on auger duty, light tillage, and emergency pull work. It has 28,400 total hours. Second engine overhaul completed in 2034 for $9,800 in parts and machine shop labor. It is not a museum piece. It is still a tool. Mercer Repair Supply employs 14 people across 2 sites, all full-time with health benefits and paid training blocks. Trust assets fluctuate with markets and land values, but the latest audited statement showed roughly $9,300,000 under management. Active contracts with 9 producers, and default rate at 0 because contracts are built to fit cash flow reality before signatures happen. And the multiplier is no longer theoretical. It is visible from county tax rolls, school enrollments holding steady, and fewer young families leaving for lack of entry paths. My mother still lives in Salina and keeps one framed photo of my father in his first dealership office, sleeves rolled, hopeful and unguarded. She visited Glenn once in 2028 to thank him for hiring me when she was sure no one would. Glenn told her, "Your husband worked hard. He just trusted leverage too much." She cried in the truck on the way home. But she told me those tears were clean. No blame left in them. As for me, I stayed. I own 12% of Mercer Repair Supply now, purchased gradually from earnings, no borrowed money. My son, the one I barely spoke to during my salesman years, because I was always on the road chasing quotas, works summers in the parts warehouse while studying ag economics. We are not fixed by one conversation, but we are no longer strangers at the same table. I learned that numbers can wound or shelter depending on what story they are serving. The old dealership building where I grew up is still standing, but it no longer sells monthly payment dreams under bright lights. It houses used components, welding sparks, coffee thermoses, and a bulletin board covered in handwritten notes from farmers swapping labor and parts. The sign out front reads Mercer Repair Supply and Soil Trust Office. Some afternoons, a man in patched overalls walks through with a clipboard, checks filter inventories, and leaves before anyone can thank him properly. People still misjudge by appearance. They probably always will. A rusted truck still gets side-eye at certain stops, and a quiet man still gets talked over by louder ones. But in Concordia, Hutchinson, Reno County, and Cloud County, there is now a standing counterexample that nobody can deny. The old iron outlasted the sales model that mocked it. The man who looked broke held enough strength to carry others. The wealth was real, but the point was never accumulation by itself. The point was staying free enough to choose mercy when it mattered. I opened with a gate and smoke because that was the night everything I believed about value was tested at once. Machinery, money, pride, fear, and whatever stood in those trees. I started this story as the son of a dealer who measured success in volume financed. But I live it now beside a farmer who measures success in families still on land 10 years later. I still do not know what that figure was at the lower draw, and I have stopped needing a clean label for it. If you have had one moment that changed your arithmetic on life, the next story is on your screen.